And now we're thrilled to welcome Kathryn Nuernberger to the show. Kate's latest book is The Witch of I, which is about witches and witch trials. She is also the author of the poetry collections Rue, The End of Pink, and Rag and Bone, as well as the collection of lyric essays, Brief Interviews with the Romantic Past. Her awards include the James Laughlin Prize from the Academy of American Poets, an NEA Fellowship, and notable essays in the Best American Essay series. She teaches poetry and nonfiction for the MFA program at the University of Minnesota. Where have I heard of that before? But before that, she taught here nearby where I live at the University of Central Missouri, and now she is Sugi's colleague. Kate, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's nice to be near you again virtually, Whitney, and Sugi, it's always nice to see you.
Yay. Kate, it's great to have you back on the show. And you just published 2 books, one of essays and one of poems, which prompts me to ask you, what are you, some kind of witch? Can we start off by talking about the connections between these 2 projects and how they sort of almost dovetailed in terms of publication?
Sure. Well, I started writing the poetry collection Rue when I was living in rural Missouri on an old, my partner was trying to make a homestead of a defunct farm. And while I was living there, this was in the period in Missouri where reproductive rights were being pretty steadily eroded in our state through all kinds of like specious requirements that Planned Parenthood and other providers had to go through in terms of like the width of the hallways, or they were creating hoops for doctors to jump through in terms of certifications, just all manner of chipping away relentlessly at the right to choose. And I was feeling in this rural community, this rural conservative community, the alienation, the loneliness, I was also in the rage of being trapped inside of, I don't know, what I would describe as an aspiring patriarchal theocracy that had really was kind of running the show there. And yeah, so it was a hard place to live, and I was angry all the time, and I didn't really feel like I had a lot of people to talk to or connect with in that community. So I started talking to the flowers in our field. And when I say talking to, I sometimes mean in a deeply addled way, and I sometimes mean in terms of researching them, harvesting them, experimenting with their food and medicinal properties, and then writing like with them or about them. And what I found in the course of that sad, strange time in my life, whenever I looked up these plants, was that almost all of them, at somewhere in the list of their uses, and have this euphemism used to provoke the menses, which is a way of saying used for birth control. And there was something about that struck me as sort of wonderful, just to have this sort of like defiant counter narrative about what it is to be natural, what it is to be alive, what it is to be a flower in the field, just sort of like constantly blooming around me. So I was writing poems about them and feeling invigorated by their presence in my life. And but running into that euphemism used to provoke the menses, I was like, okay, so like I kind of get it, but like when I started writing the poems, we want to be specific and have imagery. I didn't want to write a cookbook or a how-to manual, because I don't think they're not the most reliable method for birth control. I don't want anybody to feel like they have to use Queen Anne's lace instead of just get a prescription from their doctor or go to Planned Parenthood and get an abortion if that's what they choose to do. But I wanted the poems to feel vivid, and I couldn't figure out what part, because no one was willing to say anything specific, because, you know, maybe you'll get prosecuted, or maybe that wisdom has been erased by centuries of oppression. So I had this idea, when I wasn't finding out any details, that maybe I would look at witch trials, because I had heard that many of the accused witches had been midwives. And I thought maybe like the spells that they were using, or their description of their rituals, I thought maybe somewhere in there would be like information I could kind of like read a counter narrative into and figure out how the plants were being used. And I didn't find that at all, but I did find these like really rich, fascinating portraits of people who were just, in many cases, just middle fingers at the patriarchy in all directions in those trials. And that was a different sort of delight for me. So I ended up kind of like floating on both of these research tracks and writing in different ways, but with a similar mood in mind.
I mean, obviously, witches were hunted in America, as they have, and they've been used as a way, a sort of euphemism for basically like hey, this is a woman who doesn't do what we want from the male point of view, and so let's call her a witch, and that's there. We're going to make her easier to attack, right? And we're looking at, privates. We've been talking about SB 8 and the Texas abortion law in the earlier parts of the show, and we now have a situation where private citizens are being rewarded for going after abortion providers, which sort of seems like a different way of reporting witches in essence, right? And I wondered if you could just talk about that entry point. You've done this already, like just expand on that a little bit about the way that you write about witches in The Witch of I and how you connect that to contemporary American life.
Right. So, yeah. So witches are just women with agency is an expression I've heard. And what was interesting to me is so the reason midwives often seem to come into the crosshairs of, so in the medieval and early modern period, it was only recently that the definition of like when life begins could even be like conception wasn't even like a notion. It was quickening was the working definition of when a pregnancy began for like much of the period when the witch trials would have been happening. And so, so what happened before that was just regulating the menses, provoking the menses. It was considered like a normal part of your healthcare, not controversial. So that's part of why any like plant medicines or other ways of inducing abortion that midwives might have been practicing wouldn't have been considered a crime or wouldn't have been on their radar. What was considered problematic to the power elite in many instances, I mean, the witch trial has gone for like 800 years and every one has its kind of different historical peculiarities or particularities. But one of the through lines that would happen is, so if you're
so long.
I know,
seems
so
crazy.
And so many different scapegoats at different moments, right? Like, so sometimes it might be midwives, other times it might be people that we would now describe as LGBTQ plus, or other times it would be Jewish people. Like there's so many different ways to marginalize on other people and then use that as an excuse to pin whatever your like civic problem is on them. So, but midwives were able to be financially independent because they were basically the doctors of their communities. Like what we think of as like modern medicine, and the male notion of the doctor doesn't really emerge until after the Enlightenment. So for much of human history, it's women who are delivering babies and then also like just generally responsible for people's healthcare. And you pay people for that if they have specialized knowledge. So what you end up with is women in the community who are trusted with secrets and trusted with knowledge and trusted with money. And they end up in many cases being able to own their own property and be of independent means, which of course, this is bedeviling to the patriarchy. Like, oh my God, something's wrong with that person because she is able to be in control of her own life in a way that we generally are able to prevent from happening to certain members of our society.
Right. And then that sort of agency is unnatural, right? And unfeminine and all of that sort of thing. And in the introduction to The Witch of I, you write, and I'm quoting here, they called the old women crones, hags, cunning women, and witches. Names to make a daughter think she should devote herself to becoming something, anything other than what she is. Like the women I descend from, the ones called hysterics and manics, obsessives and depressives, I feel as if I have an aspen grove that stretches from my stomach to my throat. And it was interesting because I read this, I was lucky to be an early reader for this book and to kind of go back to it in the context of this conversation and think about SB 8 was really interesting because you're of course pointing right there to this, the publicly contested part of a woman's body. And there's a sense of a movement that's really desperate to prevent women from becoming as powerful as their witchy, independent mothers, and another movement that's been successful in bequeathing knowledge about our bodies from our stomachs to our throat. I mean, just thinking about what you said about provoking the menses, I've been doing a little bit of research on reproductive rights and abortion providers in Sri Lanka, where I think for a long time, like it's been referred to as quote unquote womb cleaning.
Yeah.
Which is, I think it's common, and that one is common in other places as well. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about women's generational and informal and communal knowledge, like the ways that knowledge exists outside and beyond institutions and the law, and how that knowledge works in the fight for women's healthcare.
Yeah, so more like so one of the reasons I was drawn to writing about witches too, I think was I started writing about them during the Trump campaign and then like in the wake of Trump's election. And so I was it's a very hopeless sort of hope. I was finding a very despairing sort of hope in their trials because their defiance mostly still ends in their death. Like all they can figure out how to do is just speak the truth of their experience and insist upon like their own like right to their integrity before like it goes really badly for them. And I feel like we've been living through sort of years of just constantly whittling away at our hope for the future and our sense of rights and safety and security. And we see that so many people, I see so many people around me with like fewer rights than they started their lives with. So the witch trials, I guess what I was going to say is it's a really depressing history and it's a sad sort of hope. But when I want to really feel good, I think about the Jane Collective, which was this group of women who really did create an underground underground network to provide abortions in the period when it was illegal. Those medical practitioners went to jail for providing women with healthcare.
Just for our listeners, what years are you talking about here?
I'm pretty sure the Jane Collective was the 50s. Maybe the 60s. I'm also really fascinated by Angela Hume is a St. Paul-based scholar and poet, and she's been writing about Pat Parker's work with the Women's Health Center in San Francisco, this was immediately after Roe v. Wade, as soon as abortions became legal. I mean, I think she was involved too in women's healthcare before that, but she was very active in creating a collective for providing women's healthcare services and navigating and pushing forward the laws to make healthcare widely available. So she was working both as a writer and also like starting a press and then using both the clinic to run the press and then using the press to run the clinic, like having those sort of finances be pretty fungible in ways that I think are also really fascinating models. Let's see, I guess it's also maybe worth thinking about looking at the history of plant medicines, there was this medieval theory called the doctrine of signatures, which is that it doesn't look great. It's not great science. That if you look at the plant will tell you what it can be used for, which is how you get some kind of notions about medicine that seem pretty wacky now, right? Which is walnuts look like brains, therefore they'll help you with your headache, or which does not seem to be
good. That's how I've been using them.
If you look at ivermectin hard enough, it'll make you feel like it gets rid of COVID.
Oh, geez. But there are plants like toothbright, where the blossom in spring maybe looks like a little tooth, and that does seem to have had there are actually properties in that plant that would help to ease a toothache. And it seems to me that so the philosophers, the Catholic men, were very excited about saying this proves the existence of God, and God has given us these plants and makes the plants look like what God intends us to use them for, which is kind of fun to think about when you're encountering all these plants that are used for birth control, right? If you've been like me, if you've been raised inside of an oppressive Catholic tradition that kept insisting that you need to follow God's plan to have a baby, and then you're like, well, if God made all these plants and who broke the menses, I'm not sure this all holds up. But I'm also really interested as a writer, a storyteller, person interested in language. What I see in the doctrine of signatures is a really interesting oral tradition method, which is to say where we are using these visual metaphors as a way to actually just carry forward centuries of knowledge that can only be passed through the oral tradition, particularly because literacy wasn't available to the women who would have been midwives. So there's this long tradition of trying to carry forward a ton of knowledge. The other place that you find the plant medicine information is once literacy is more common, is you'll find 19th century and 18th century cookbooks that are just teeming in the margins with remedies and ailments that it seems that women were swapping back and forth and jotting down in the same way they would recipes, because they were the people who were responsible for their family's healthcare. But all of these things are easily erased. And while I love a scientific method and a double-blind study and all of the mechanisms that make vaccines possible, I also feel very aware of the ways in which the medical system that we have is deeply rooted in a kind of patriarchy that that enters the sphere of healthcare in like the wake of the Enlightenment and actively sought to like eradicate midwives from the field as much as possible. And so like also like, right, so you have like this long history of knowledge being passed through the centuries through the oral tradition. And then like once men get involved in delivering babies, well, like all of a sudden you have this like massive increase in maternal mortality because you have all these male doctors coming in, like delivering babies, but introducing sepsis, puerperal fever, and all these problems because like they spent the morning dissecting cadavers and then they come to the, spend the afternoon delivering babies and they don't wash their hands in between and they can't figure out why all their patients are dying. And they don't notice that the midwives, patients are like it wasn't until they noticed the dramatic disparities between their outcomes that they realized they needed to wash their hands and stop touching dead bodies before they delivered babies.
In that same introduction that we've been talking about, and the question that Suki asked, you write that, by the way, the ivermectin thing, not connected to what you're talking about, just a little joke that I slipped in there. And I don't think they're part of the same tradition in any way. But I do think like the reasons that you talk about for distrusting healthcare is like in the air, like, and there are legitimate ones, right, that happen over time, for instance, in the Black community, which we've also talked about on the show. And for those reasons why women would just distrust healthcare. And that doesn't help, right? When you're trying also to get people to trust it, to take a medicine that would help them and it's not working, to get them to trust it. All right. So in that same introduction, you write that for 1,000 years, the theory of medicine was the same as the theory of magic. The thing that knits these worlds together across generations in so much of your work is plants, like we've been talking about here. Can you talk a little bit about that, which you have already, and then read from your poem regarding silphium?
Yeah, well, I think what I want to say about plants being used for birth control is that silphium, which I'll read to you about in a second, is the only one I encountered that seems to have that has any legends of being anywhere near as reliable or efficacious as anything we have now, right? So like I'm interested in this history of plants for reasons related to the undermining the oppressive theology that I was raised inside of, because I'm interested in like attending to the ways that we're intertwined with our ecosystems. I'm not interested in eating Queen Anne's lace seeds and crossing my fingers that it will work to not have a baby, right? So I guess
don't try this at home, kids.
Don't try it at it's notable that all of these methods were erased because that's about control, and it's also just worth clinging to our extremely reliable and efficacious birth control that we have at present, or at least that some of us still do. So regarding silphium, the birth control of the Roman Empire for 600 years extincted by careless land management in the year 200 AD. When I was just about done being married and he was a blossomed out nerve of seeing himself through the ugly eyes of how I had come to see him and myself for letting our lives get so Tupperware fur molded, for thinking I could lace and pinprick it back with just the right delicacy, when a good punch in the face was what a mess this bad required. I know you're thinking a punch in the face is never the answer, but that's the lace talking. When I was just about done with the lace-throated maybe violence, our daughter, who is 5, told me how he broke. She didn't say he broke. She said he got really worked up, driving past all the protesters outside Planned Parenthood on Providence Avenue, from which the University Medical School had just withdrawn funding, and also the option for residents to do training there. How he took a hard left into the parking lot and with our daughter by the hand, marched in with an urgency that made the young man working the desk say, "Sir," with some alarm. He took a breath to be more steady and said, "I'm so sorry about all of this, all of that out there, and I just thought I'd make a donation." As he pulled all the money from his wallet, some of it crumpled, a mixture of 5s and 1s, and pushed it across the counter, our daughter watching and looking around the room, studying the faces of timid and nervous young people I imagine in those plastic chairs I remember from when I once sat in this exact waiting room myself so many years ago, feeling embarrassed and ashamed because it seemed that's what I was supposed to feel. Though if I could have felt my way beyond supposed to back then to my actual self, I would have known I didn't feel sorry at all. only annoyed by the tedium of appointments, the practical necessity of that clean smell, the chilly, dustless air of a building with nothing soft except the aspect of the resident, who is the only doctor I've ever had who joked as she put her gloved hand in my body. I guess this is the most awkward thing you'll do today, huh? It was funny and made me feel like we've been friends a long time. My husband, who is still my husband after all, knew that story, and I guess he wanted our daughter to somehow know it too. Sometimes you'll feel very alone, I tell her in a day when I find her pressing her face against the window, watching the children next door play in the grass, wiping tears from her face as fast as they fall. Other times, you'll be so wonderfully surprised by the strange bridges people manage to build out to you when you never would have expected they could.
Thank you so much. Silphium isn't the only, and I'm actually not sure I know how to say it, abortifacient. Am I saying it right?
I've heard people say abortifacient or abortifacient.
Okay, I guess I'm going to go with abortifacient. And
Silphium, say it with confidence and no one will doubt you.
Abortifacient. Silphium isn't the only abortifacient you wrote about, of course, because you wrote about pennyroyal and others. And I wonder how you have already spoken about the fact that these are not really in use anymore. How did you research these? This sounds like such a maze and maybe also pretty fun.
Yeah. It took me a long time to actually get get those images I wanted to, since the witch trials were a dead end. I would, like, if people are interested in knowing more, John Riddle's Eve's Herbs, I ended up finding kind of late in the process, and is a pretty comprehensive compendium. I also would recommend Kate Laveau's book, The Book of Difficult Fruit. The chapter on juniper has a lot of really good resources. And one of the things she talks about that I really appreciate in that chapter that has been on my mind is an ambivalence about the tradition of herbalism as it relates to this conversation, because I think, especially because, like, I'm just very split, because I appreciate the way in which herbalism is often thinking ecologically about our bodies and our permeability to the ecosystems we live intertwined with. I also appreciate that it's maybe trying to resuscitate these like this oral tradition of women's knowledge about medicine. I'm also really troubled about the ways in which it gets really entangled with anti-vax movements. And you can sometimes see, especially where like plant medicines come in the conversation about birth control, sometimes there's a sort of suggestion that there's like, oh, there's just a love affair with the notion of the natural in ways that get really complicated. The like love affair with the notion of the natural in terms of like natural childbirth and avoiding pain medication, which was something in the medieval period. You can see that it was illegal to have pain relief during childbirth, because the Bible says the reason that women have pain during childbirth is because of Eve's fall from grace. So like, and you actually do, there are accounts of people being executed for having had whatever pain relief is available. So like, I feel skeptical about that. And also, there's even maybe like a suggestion that like a plant-based abortion is somehow more natural than a surgical abortion, which seems very troubling to me, considering how effective and safe surgical abortions are. And the plant ones aren't being talked about very openly. So I was also in a conversation with herbalists at one point where I was asking them about Queen Anne's lace and rue and columbine and pennyroyal. You already mentioned, Suki. So so I was asking about Queen Anne's lace because I was like, I've been reading these blogs and it seems like there's a debate among herbalists about like whether you take it like a morning after pill or whether you take it like contraception that you would be taking it, and then like do you take it every day or just like the 2 weeks when you're ovulating, which then makes it like kind of like the rhythm method. And also when do you harvest the seeds? And also, do you have to chew the seeds to release the tannins? And is that disgusting? Or do you just swallow them with a glass of water? And how does it make your stomach feel? And I was asking all these questions, and they were not in agreement, these two herbalists, on the answers, which, reaffirmed my desire not to use this as my preferred birth control method. And then one of them was like, also like, oh yeah, and anyway, I got pregnant while I was using Queen Anne's lace. And I was like, but she was saying that she was she was interested in experimenting with plants. She had also was like, she was like, it's fine if I get pregnant right now. Like, so she was like, she was not looking for a reliable method. She was like, just like curious how the plants would work, which is like a little bit where herbalism is at, right? Is that if it's not being, well, anyway, I don't want to enrage herbalists. I love plants.
We do have a large number of herbalists among in our listenership. I'm sure that, I
never like pissing off herbal Twitter. It's a fucking shit show over there.
I do love the idea that you started a rousing debate between these two herbalists as you were doing your research.
And then like the other herbalist jumped in. We're flipping also through plant books, and then she jumps in. We're looking at Queen's Egg.
How many herbalists does it take to screw in a light bulb?
We get to this other plant, and this other herbalist who's older says, "Oh, and that's the plant that got me pregnant." Like got the plant, and the plant that got me pregnant. I was like, "Oh my God, you have the worst birth control." But she was actually had been unable to conceive for many years, and that she had like started a new regimen with this other plant that was designed to treat some issues that she was. I think it might have been like endometriosis or something. Anyway, this plant apparently worked so well that like at age like 43, she had a surprise baby.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Anyway, my whole takeaway was I just really, really want Republicans to stop screwing with my birth control.
That's where all paths lead to that thought, I feel like.
Yeah. Well, I wanted you to read. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Something else.
No, it's fine.
So we had Elizabeth Wetmore wrote a really interesting description of one of her characters visiting a clinic. And you described the clinic in the poem that you just read. And it also made me think of Agnes Sampson, wife of Keith, an essay from The Witch of I. There's a way in which what happens to Agnes reminds me of abortion clinics or Planned Parenthood surrounded by protesters. So I wondered if you could read from that piece also.
Sure. Yeah. Agnes Sampson ends up in the crosshairs of King James's witch trials in after Euphemia McLean accuses her under torture of having provided her with pain relief during her labor. So Agnes Sampson was her midwife. Agnes Sampson, known by all of her patients and clients as the wise wife of Keith, was famous for the help she could offer women who wanted children, women who didn't, women in love, and women in pain. When the king decided he wanted to interrogate this wise wife personally, she had been shaved bald, tortured with a rope around her neck for an hour after being pinned to a wall for days by the witch's bridle, which is an iron muzzle with a bit to hold down a woman's tongue. Sampson began at last to speak after her naked body was inspected and a suspicious mark that was said to be the place where the devil put his tongue was found on her privates. This is almost always the way in witch trials. Once the witch knows her mark has been seen, she gives up hope she'll ever slip away from this. She may as well help her inquisitors plan that long walk to the altar. Agnes Sampson confessed so rapidly and so much. A dead cat was thrown in the sea. There was some kind of spell involving the chiefest part of a dead man. A black toad hung up by his heels. This peasant woman, that peasant woman. The king said he could hardly believe her. With one eye on the instruments hanging from the wall of her cell, she took the king aside and declared unto him the very words which had passed between the king's majesty and his queen the first night of their marriage. After that, James wondered greatly and swore by the living God that he believed all of the devils in hell could not have discovered the same. To this day, none of us knows what these words were. They might have been sweetly romantic or frankly political. You could try to remember the words that passed on the first night of your marriage, or the words you would say if you were to do it all over again. But you would have to conclude there is no way to know what love and marriage are to a person is, as much as any of us can be, living a life that is also an emblem for others. From the wise wife of Keith, the king learned 200 more names in the coven, including that of James Fian, a schoolmaster and the rare male sorcerer, who would soon enough become another subject tortured into confession. He told his crimes like an old tale. Once upon a time, he had tried to use a spell to make a woman love him back. He sent a pupil to get the young woman's hair, but her mother intervened and sent the little boy back with hairs from the udder of a cow, which is how he came to be followed everywhere by a lovesick bovine. Surely the children he taught would have laughed at this punchline the first time he told that story. It seems unlikely that the inquisitor laughed, since Fian's legs were crushed in a contraption called the boots the next time he told it. The character of a king is a way of believing things happen for a reason. The queen is a way of being angry at someone besides God. A witch is a woman who thought her story ended with that wedding a dozen pages back, and now she'd be allowed to do as she pleased. I wonder which of these I would have been, and I wonder which I am now. I might have fallen in love. I might have been burned. I might have given up the name of my own dear friend. I might have set the hour of execution, might have pulled the fingernails, might have set the pins, might have been pregnant, might have lost my child. I might have looked around at all I owned and wondered how I could ever hold on to it all. I might walk past those bodies hanging in the town square and know they are intended to mean something to me, but head down, I have this cart to drag miles yet through the rock and mud before I can warm my hands by a fire, the one my husband is feeding with small sticks even now, and thinking how soon I'll be home. I might be the one who tells this story when I get there, but if I have any sense at all, you could be sure the tale will end on a note of how happily, how wise, how just everything turned out in the end.
Thank you very much. Those torture devices, man, what in the, it's so disturbing. How imaginative they are.
Yeah. I think it's Susan Sontag has written a book called Regarding the Pain of Others, where she talks about torture and why people torture and what it does for those who would participate in it and who also want their government to do it on their behalf. And one of the things about torturers is it seems like they have a problem believing other people are real, and specifically that other people's pain is real. And so the act of torturing becomes this attempt to believe that other people also have feelings, and perhaps to like somehow reaffirm their own humanity. But of course that's an impossible, torture can't do what they want it to do, right? Like, but that seems to be part of the sort of escalation of extreme and bizarrely creative devices, is that it's people who want to believe other people are real and somehow can't manage it,
and so cause them pain to see what that would be like. The connection that I draw when I was thinking about that essay that you read was between, and because all these other things are happening, we just did an episode about Afghanistan and we were thinking about 9/11 and also the war on terror, and then also that's when we started officially torturing again as a country, which was really nice thing for us. And I don't feel like that torture and the introduction of torture into official government business of the United States is unconnected from the stuff that we're talking about in Texas and Texas abortion law and the assigning of people to go narc on each other and all this stuff is, and then it all is so resonant with these women that you're writing about in your essay book. I don't have anything to say about that except that I hope that people will go read the book and feel and notice those resonances. One other resonance that we wanted to ask you about is, maybe we could draw a line between Agnes or the male sorcerer that you mentioned and Dr. Allen, who gets put in the boots, which I would prefer not to have on. Dr. Alan Braid, the doctor, is now facing out-of-state suits for performing an abortion in Texas that violated the new Texas law and then declaring so publicly.
One of the things I thought about a lot while I was writing this book and that I wanted and tried very hard to be careful about was when and how I used metaphor, because witch trials get thrown around as an easy, lazy metaphor so often, usually by people who would clearly be the witch hunters, and they're like, it's a witch hunt, I'm being accused.
It doesn't feel like a metaphor. It's a real thing when you're writing about it. These are actual facts. We're not talking about metaphor. We're talking about history. Right.
So what I wanted to do, and also I kind of, one of the reasons I was so interested in chapter after chapter is each one is about a different witch, or they're not witches really, but a different accused witch, and the particularities of that trial. And one of the reasons that I didn't think the subject would have a book's worth of essays in it, because I thought each trial would look like the next, but each particular instance was so different and discrete in and of itself that I found that fascinating, and I kept going back to more. All of which is to say, I admire Dr. Braid's risky, bold gambit, right? Like it's brave, it's necessary, it's what needs to be done. And it's a little different from most of the witch trials I can think of, because it seems that Dr. Braid is going into this with a very strategic plan in place, right? Which is to provoke the test case and hopefully like have this law made
and he's going to be supported and not end up wearing the boots.
Right. Like he's probably going to have to pay that fine, I guess, and that's probably going to be paid by donation. So it's willingly entering the trials with like a particular strategy in mind, which seems a little bit different from what tended to happen to many of the midwives, at least, because they were certainly operating in a field that would have like been a precarious and vulnerable one, because they were surely aware that it was risky to be a woman of property and means in a patriarchal society. However, typically the way it actually worked for midwives, the way the social control mechanisms worked, is that what they wanted you to do, they would call you in, they'd accuse you of witchcraft, and what they wanted you to do was confess, give what was called a quote unquote right confession. You were supposed to confess and say you were very sorry and very contrite, and you would never do it again, and then you would pay a fine. And all of that was designed to keep them in their place. And so the cases that we know about, the ones that get made examples of, and Agnes Sampson is one, but maybe Lisbeth Nypen is a Norwegian witch that I found very interesting. And another, Walpurga Hausmann. And what's interesting about them is that they're either, Isabel Gowdy is actually a really great one too. They come in and they're either defiant and they refuse to confess, and I guess it's actually in their refusal to confess, their refusal to say that they did it, that is their act of resistance, or they just don't see it coming, that there's other social forces happening so fast that they think they can come in and just give like a quick confession and pay their fine and go home. But but for whatever reason, things have changed and become politically tumultuous. So what's required is a scapegoat, and they didn't expect it. So it's just it's interesting to note the differences, I guess, but it's also interesting to note the myriad ways that hegemonic patriarchies have of exerting control, right? They're just ingenious. They just keep coming up with different ways so that you can never quite see like what strategy is going to be required next, or you never quite know where you are, what's coming. So, so I admire, so the witches I would compare Dr. Braid's move to are probably more like Tituba of Salem, who was not a midwife, but she did game the court system in really ingenious ways and came out alive, and never confessed, never accused anyone who hadn't already been accused, which means she came out with her integrity intact. And I found that instance really compelling. Maria Barbosa was someone who stood trial, who came in and willingly walked into her own trial in Portugal. She was a Brazilian witch that the ship they were bringing over to stand trial was shipwrecked, and then not shipwrecked, it was taken over by pirates and then shipwrecked, and then she ended up like walking into her trial, and she did that willingly to make a point. Like she walked in a haggard state and said, please give me a cloak, and I am not the woman you imagine me to be. And that seemed like it was sort of intentionally designed to flip the script on the inquisitors and like make them recognize who the real monster was in the room, I suppose.
I take your point about sort of the glib usage of witch trials as a metaphor. I think the thing that I see as a parallel between that and now with SB8 is the invitation to a community to surveil itself, which of course I would latch onto, coming from a community that surveils itself constantly. And it seems like, yeah, like these Maria Barbosa or Dr. Braid is sort of like attempts to puncture this. Like, I will openly go ahead and gossip about me, if you will. Like, I will give you on the record my act of defiance, is really interesting to me. It does seem like distinctive among recent American laws in its invitation to community surveillance, in a way that, yeah, I feel like it erodes social fabric in it. Like Whitney was talking earlier about torture, and like there's of course the psychological torture of being watched in your every daily move by everyone around you, and wondering, like, is it the receipt for gas or at the gas station in a town far away where there's a clinic, or the the phone call I made to my sister, or, you know, what have you, like, what will be the thing that, will it be the person I pass on the way to the clinic that doesn't exist? Or I don't know, all of that, that is also a kind of being watched, is, I think, the thing that reminds me of what I know about witch trials, which is of course far less than what you know about witch trials. I'm also curious about the role of men in this conversation. I think is really interesting because, I mean, I love in regarding Silphium, the defiant donation from your husband, and then there's also the opposite version contained in the Agnes Sampson lines. In a fairy tale, a dangerous woman with power turns a man into the most beastly version of himself. A beautiful, silent, and perfectly stupid girl waits patiently to be taken by him. And then we all live once more happily ever after. In a witch trial, you hear a version of this story over and over again. And this, like, also reminds me of how people talk about abortion, like the essential danger of abortion is actually that in some way, almost like the unsaid echo of people talking about this is like, oh, but we might corrupt or undermine men, right? Like that it will be their undoing in some way. Like there's a kind of fear of contagion of even discussing it.
What I've been thinking about in terms of the stories that get told and like around witch trials and witches and what's happening with SB8, I've been thinking about the critique of, oh, well, like every time one of these sort of like heartbreaking, corroding new laws kind of goes into effect, there's like this flurry of like tweet your abortions or people telling their abortion stories, right? And it seems like, and it, to my mind, they're powerful, and to a certain, they're not as effective as we want. I guess I'm not sure how effective they are. To me, they seem like they're. I really appreciate the gesture that anyone who tells that their story is making towards sort of saying like maybe a story of my humanity and my difficult, complex life and the decisions I made about my body inside of that complexity will make you see that this doesn't make sense, that this law doesn't make sense, it's cruel, and that this isn't what you want. This isn't the world you want to live in. And maybe my story will be part of that. And that we get these cascade of heart-wrenching stories. And I also think it's really compelling, the critique some people are saying, which is like, what is this culture we have where we just year after year keep cascading out these like traumatizing stories designed to try to convince people that like we have brains and capacities to make like basic healthcare decisions and also moral ones. And I guess, and so I guess like in terms of the witch trials, right, like a lot of times their function was to tell a story about who's in power, why they're in power, and why they're, you know, like it wasn't just that they got burned in the town square or hanged in the town square. There was also like, as soon as there was a printing press, there were pamphlets that had like dehumanizing caricatures, often anti-Semitic ones, of whoever the people were, and that these were widely posted so that they were used as propaganda. So, you know, so what you would have is you'd have, say, an Agnes Sampson or an Isabel Gowdy or someone who is executed and their story is made a cautionary tale. And then at that point, then you can have another 200 years of everybody in town just coming in and giving their right confession and paying their fine and going back to keep themselves modest and humble on their tiny piece of land. I'm not quite answering your question about the contagion effect with men. I guess I'm thinking more about like, yeah, I've just been thinking a lot about that onslaught of stories.
I think those things are related, right? Like even, I don't know, Whitney's track earlier about the ivermectin or the contagious dog, the distance, right? Like the idea that like a story itself is like a kind of contagion, which maybe even is like the way we think about like getting some, like that could be good. I don't know, like there's sort of like the default assumption that something trending on Twitter is good. Which I guess is what you're contesting, which is I think fair. Like, yeah, what does it do for us to read those over and over again? People don't owe us those stories, actually. I think that's a really good point. I do want to ask you one of the reasons I think this book is tremendous, and it has your powerful, very often very funny voice in it. And wryness and humor pervade a lot of your work. And there's also some wrestling in the book with what a happy ending means and what it is, which I think is related also to the question you're talking about like relating these stories of trauma. We're meant to understand birth as a happy ending, whereas for some women it's abortion that's the right conclusion. So what is the role of the happy ending here, and how do you turn that idea towards a future for women in this country, given what's going on here?
The happy ending essay I wrote at the end of the book was about Marie Laveau. And the reason I chose Marie Laveau is because she was almost the only, she it would be right to call her a witch because she owned this idea. She had a voodoo practice. She engaged in magic. She was very religious too. She was also Catholic. And she had like, used root work, had deep knowledge of medicine. I didn't say too much about her voodoo practice or her root work because I didn't want to appropriate other people's spiritual traditions. Kept all of my critiques lodged inside of the Catholic tradition that I was indoctrinated in. And but what I was really struck by with her is how incredibly effective she was, how like, if you read her obituaries after she died, for the most part, like she was just universally loved by the community in which she lived, and she survived and was incredibly effective. And I was like, what spell is this and how do we do it, right? And it seemed like the nature of her power, or like the kind of like magic I saw her pulling that I feel like I could speak to or try to apply in my own life, was that she was like an incredibly savvy politician in terms of her abolitionist activism. She figured out how to game both like the real estate system under Louisiana law and the adoption system, so that what she was able to do is that when enslaved women entered into relationships with freed white men, she was able to move around both money and birth certificates in such a way that the children were able to be free and to inherit wealth from their fathers. And she pulled this off without ending up in prison or on trial. And I just found that extraordinary. Like other things she did too was like during the yellow fever outbreak, she was like, I think had like a medical clinic in her front lawn. At one point she provided shelter and housing to displaced Choctaw women. So she just had this like she had both this rich spiritual life that included the practice of magic, but what she also had was this incredibly savvy, practical, effective political activism. So so for me, I feel like that would be I don't know how we get that happy ending, right? I don't know I don't know what it looks like in terms of like the rallies that were happening today around the country, in terms of the various kinds of challenges to this law, in terms of packing the Supreme Court. Like, I don't know what the combination of effective ingenuity looks like, but I think that might be one kind of happy ending for us as like a society and a community.
Thank you so much. It's been a huge pleasure to have this conversation with you. I'm lucky I get to work with you. Thanks for being on the show.
Wow, I feel the same way. I'm so glad I worked with you too, Sugi, and so glad to be friends with you, Whitney.
Thanks, Kate. We encourage our readers and listeners to go out and pick up The Witch of I and Rue.